people who got revenge using nothing but the exact rules written in the handbook, what did you do? I used to work at a mid-sized tech company where the employee handbook was roughly the thickness of a Bible and written with the soul of a lawyer who hadn't slept since 1992. Most people had never read it. I hadn't either until my boss Gary decided to make my life hell. Gary was the kind of guy who looked like he microwaved fish in the break room just to feel something. He hated me for a reason. I still don't know. Maybe I reminded him of his son or the mailman his wife liked too much. Anyway, Gary started nitpicking everything I missed a meeting. He wrote me up. I took a bathroom break too long. Write up. I didn't reply to an email fast enough. Another one. After the third write-up in 2 weeks, HR told me I'd be fired with one more incident, and Gary practically floated out of that office like he'd just won the lottery. So I did the one thing no employee had ever done. I actually read the handbook. That thing had rules on rules on rules. Stuff so oddly specific, I'm convinced the writer had beef with someone. And then there it was. Paragraph 14b, subsection, Remote Environment Rights. Line 3. Employees disciplined by management for time efficiency issues have the right to request a full audit of managerial time usage to ensure equal application of policy. I swear I heard angels singing. I filed a request that same day. HR's eyes widened like I'd spoken an ancient curse. They had to comply. The handbook said so 10 different ways. The audit meant Gary had to log every minute of his workday and justify it with documentation for 4 straight weeks. And because audits applied retroactively, they pulled his calendar, emails, door logs, everything. I don't think anyone realized how bad this would be. Turns out Gary didn't do anything. And I mean that literally, half of his calendar was blank. He spent 3 hours a day off-site, but GPS badge pings showed he was sitting at a Starbucks watching YouTube. He marked meetings as client development, but HR found no clients. He billed administrative work, but had no files to show for it. The best part, he logged 5 2-hour lunches in a single week. HR called me back in. I thought I was about to get fired. Instead, the HR lady muttered, "We didn't know," like she'd accidentally summoned a demon. 2 days later, Gary was escorted out by security, red-faced and sweaty, carrying his sad cardboard box. The entire office watched. He glared at me like I'd ruined his life. I had delightfully. A week later, HR sent out a company-wide reminder to review the handbook for personal knowledge and compliance. Half the office immediately looked at me. Suddenly, I was the guy who defeated a boss using a technicality like it was a Yu-Gi-Oh! Trap card. My favorite part, Gary tried to appeal the termination. The handbook shut him down. Paragraph 14b was ironclad. After that, people bought me drinks, asked me to find more loopholes. And someone even called me Handbook Batman, but the true revenge. 3 months later, I got promoted to Gary's position. Same desk, same office, same window view. I even inherited his world's best boss mug, which I kept purely for the irony. I worked at a mid-sized corporate office fresh out of college, desperate to prove myself. It was the kind of place where the handbook was 3 inches thick, written in tiny legalese font, and nobody actually read it unless something terrible happened. I was assigned to a team led by a manager, let's call him Greg, who was the human embodiment of passive-aggressive micromanagement. He loved public callouts, relished pointing out minor mistakes in meetings, and had this infuriating habit of pretending policies didn't exist when it suited him. On paper, I was supposed to follow strict work hour rules, submit my weekly reports by 5 p.m. Friday, and maintain a spotless desk. But Greg had this informal, don't worry about the rules, just do what I say attitude that meant the handbook applied to everyone except him. One day, he verbally assigned me a small task that took 4 hours. The following week, he suddenly claimed I was failing to meet my quota and that my performance was under scrutiny. He sent an email that implied I was violating company policies, even though, technically, I was always compliant. The real kicker? He was notorious for bending rules for himself, taking extended lunches, leaving early, skipping mandatory reports, and rearranging deadlines on a whim. I felt trapped between the absurdity of his hypocrisy and my inability to confront him directly without risking my probation period. One night, while rereading the employee handbook for what felt like the 1,000th time, I noticed a buried clause under employee rights and responsibilities. It explicitly stated that any task assigned must be documented in writing, including clear deadlines and deliverables, and that employees are entitled to submit formal challenges if assignments are vague, disproportionate, or contradictory to company policy. My eyes widened. Every single time Greg had accused me of missing deadlines or underperforming, it was based on verbal assignments and arbitrary expectations. I realized the handbook was a weapon I hadn't considered, an exact set of rules that Greg could never manipulate without leaving a paper trail. The next Monday, I started small. I requested that all tasks be sent via email with precise deliverables and deadlines. Greg smirked at first, making jokes in the team chat about how bureaucratic I was becoming, but I didn't budge. When he tried to verbally assign a quick project at 3:30 p.m. that would take at least 2 hours, I politely said, "Please email the assignment with the expected deliverables and deadline per section 42 of the employee handbook." Greg blinked. The rest of the team was silently laughing, realizing for the first time that the rules they had all ignored could now be weaponized. It escalated quickly. Every time Greg attempted to bend the rules, I referred back to the handbook. When he claimed I had missed a team check-in, I responded with the email he had sent 3 days prior, which explicitly allowed asynchronous updates. When he tried to claim overtime was optional, I cited Section 75, which guaranteed proper overtime compensation if work exceeded the standard hours. Every informal expectation he had relied upon vanished. He could no longer accuse, manipulate, or threaten without providing documented proof. Then came the masterpiece. Greg demanded I stay late one Friday evening to complete a small but urgent report. Normally, I would have sighed, stayed late, and silently seethed. Instead, I calmly requested that he email me the task, the due time, and specify which of the mandatory reports it affected. He scowled but complied. Within 15 minutes, I had 2 conflicting email threads. One where Greg said the report was due at 6 p.m., another where he said it could be done Monday morning. I pointed this out in writing to HR, quoting the handbook sections on conflicting instructions and employee rights to clarify assignments. The next week, HR scheduled a meeting with Greg and me. I brought my binder, every task he had assigned verbally, every email chain, every conflicting instruction, perfectly annotated and cross-referenced with the handbook. HR quietly went through the binder, while Greg turned red, stammering. They eventually confirmed that several of his complaints were baseless, and they reminded him that all future assignments had to follow documented protocols. From that moment on, I became untouchable. Greg could no longer micromanage me, threaten my reviews, or give me arbitrary workloads. I still did my job, but the power dynamic had flipped. I followed the handbook to the letter, knowing it protected me. Other employees started quietly sending me messages. "Teach me your ways." I realized it wasn't just revenge, it was validation. The absurd little manual everyone ignored had become my weapon, and it worked perfectly. Greg tried a few desperate maneuvers afterward, moving deadlines around via verbal instructions, leaving notes on my desk, even sneaking sticky notes with urgent tasks. I smiled, reminded him of the handbook, and forwarded everything to HR. Each time he tried, he looked more defeated. Eventually, he stopped targeting me directly and began yelling at the photocopier, which now inexplicably refused to cooperate. By the end of the quarter, I had transformed from a timid new hire into a legend of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. I never broke any rules, but I had successfully weaponized the handbook against someone who thought policies were optional. Every victory was contained entirely within the framework of the rules, leaving me untouchable. HR satisfied and Greg utterly humiliated. And the best part, I never once broke a single rule. Every action, every countermeasure, every strategic delay was directly supported by the handbook. It was the perfect, legal, morally untouchable revenge. Greg spent the rest of the year carefully reading emails before assigning work and triple-checking deadlines, while I continued quietly submitting perfectly documented reports, smiling to myself at every ironic victory. I still occasionally catch glimpses of him staring at the handbook in horror, muttering to himself about how a simple 3-inch thick document could destroy his entire management style. I'll never forget the feeling of seeing him unravel in real time, powerless against the rules he had always ignored. Every paragraph, every clause, every footnote had become my little instrument of chaos, and it was beautiful. By the end of the year, the team unofficially crowned me the Handbook Avenger. And while I never asked for the title, it was entirely deserved. I had discovered, documented, and executed a loophole revenge strategy so elegant and absurdly bureaucratic that I'm still in awe of it. To this day, I followed the exact rules, never raised my voice, and yet the power imbalance shifted entirely. It's a story I tell new hires whenever they complain about overbearing managers. Read the manual, document everything, and let the rules do the talking. Sometimes the simplest tool in the office, ignored, underestimated, and dusty, is all you need to orchestrate the most satisfying revenge imaginable. I worked at a retail chain that prided itself on customer-first policies that, on paper, were full of loopholes no one ever noticed. One particular coworker, let's call her Amanda, was notorious for throwing her weight around and punishing anyone she didn't like. She'd assign extra tasks, nitpick reports, and manipulate scheduling so she could slack off while everyone else picked up the slack. She had a habit of reading the employee handbook selectively, quoting the rules only when it benefited her, and deliberately ignoring the rest. One day, she decided to mess with me because I'd accidentally corrected a customer's claim about a product. She pulled me aside and said, "You're not allowed to take initiative. Stick to the manual." I laughed politely, thinking she was joking, until she started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my workstation and sending me emails in all caps about proper protocol. That's when I realized it was time to weaponize the handbook. I dug through it obsessively for the next few evenings. There was a section on chain of command that stated any task assigned outside of one's immediate supervisor must be approved in writing by HR. Another clause specified that employees are entitled to refuse any task they believe violates company policy, provided they document it immediately. The more I read, the more I realized Amanda had been running around assuming she could bend these rules without consequence. The first strike came when she assigned me to audit the entire inventory of a department alone, which she claimed fell under her authority. I politely replied, quoting the handbook clause, and requested written approval from HR. She rolled her eyes but, begrudgingly, copied an HR assistant on the email. Perfect. The trap was set. Next, she tried to schedule me for extra shifts on the weekend under the guise of volunteer overtime to make me look like I wasn't pulling my weight. I printed the handbook section about voluntary overtime, which explicitly stated that any employee forced to work extra hours must be compensated double if they were not properly notified in writing. I forwarded it to the scheduling department and copied her. She didn't know how to respond. Then came the masterpiece. Amanda had been secretly rationing supplies so she could look more efficient in the monthly reports. According to the handbook, employees are required to report any mismanagement or irregularities in stock immediately. I created a meticulous document with timestamps, photographic evidence, and cross-referenced everything with the handbook sections she had ignored. I sent it to both my supervisor and HR. The email was polite, factual, and completely bulletproof. Within a week, HR scheduled a meeting. Amanda tried to argue verbally, but I had every rule in my favor. The HR manager smiled and said, "According to sections 12.4 and 12.7, your reports and the chain of evidence are accurate. Amanda, you will need to correct this immediately." Amanda turned pale, muttering something about technicalities, while I quietly sipped my coffee. From that moment, every attempt she made to manipulate, bully, or coerce me was instantly nullified by the handbook. She tried to claim a verbal assignment had priority over written procedure. Nope. Contradicted by section 7.3. She tried to enforce her own efficiency rules to penalize me? Nope, contradicted by Section 9.1. Every time she overstepped, I responded with the exact text of the policy, formatted and highlighted. HR was supportive because I wasn't complaining. I was simply following the rules. Her final attempt was desperate. She tried to spread rumors that I was sabotaging the workplace, hoping to get me written up. I calmly created a timeline of my actions, cross-referenced it with the handbook, and CC'd my supervisor, HR, and the district manager. Within days, Amanda received a formal reprimand for insubordination and abuse of policy. She spent the next month tiptoeing around, afraid to assign anything without proper documentation. Meanwhile, I continued my duties, following the handbook to the letter. Every smile, every polite reminder, every perfectly formatted email felt like a victory. Other employees began quietly sending me messages, "Teach us your ways." I felt like a general who had orchestrated a perfect campaign using nothing but logic, documentation, and the rules everyone else ignored. By the end of the quarter, Amanda had been demoted. HR regularly consulted me for policy clarifications, and I had gained an almost mythical reputation in the office. I never raised my voice, never broke a rule, and never acted outside of official channels. Every victory was contained entirely within the framework of the handbook. The most satisfying moment came during a team meeting when Amanda, flustered and cornered, tried to suggest a new protocol. I smiled and gently reminded everyone of Section 8.6, which specified that changes had to go through HR and required a documented approval process. Silence fell. She slumped in her chair, defeated, while I internally celebrated the elegance of the plan. By the time I left that company years later, employees still whispered about the Handbook Avenger, who had used nothing but the rules to turn a tyrant manager into a cautionary tale. I walked out knowing that the simplest, most ignored document in the office had been my weapon of choice, and it had worked flawlessly. So I used to work at this office where my manager, Dana, had the incredible talent of being both lazy and controlling at the same time. She loved delegating her responsibilities to me, then taking credit for the results. But whenever anything went wrong, suddenly it was my lack of initiative. Classic. Anyway, one day she decided she wanted to start coming in late, like 2 hours late, and told me to cover for her. I was stupid enough to try at first. But then she began marking me as tardy for clocking in 2 minutes after her imaginary schedule. I complained to HR. HR said everything must be documented. Follow the employee handbook, document all infractions in real time. Oh, I did. I documented her infractions, every single one. Because the handbook said employees must report policy impacting irregularities, and it did not specify that you could only report subordinates. So for 3 glorious weeks, I became the most dedicated snitch in corporate history. 9:07 a.m. Dana arrives with Starbucks claims traffic issues. 9:08 a.m. She starts a 45-minute non-work call with her sister. 11:12 a.m. She leaves for an early lunch. 12:40 p.m. She returns with shopping bags. 1:16 p.m. She tells me to send that email she forgot to write myself. 1:47 p.m. She leaves the building to take a walk to clear her head. I documented everything, attached timestamps, and sent them to HR in a polite, professional little email folder titled Managerial Performance Observations, per handbook compliance. HR called her in. She walked out, red-faced eyes, puffy and beeline to her office. My phone buzzed. It was HR thanking me for maintaining professional accountability. Next week, Dana was demoted to my old position, and I got promoted because apparently my attention to detail was exceptional. All I did was obey the handbook. I weaponized corporate compliance. Pettiest, most emotionally satisfying revenge of my life. My high school had an absolutely ridiculous dress code that targeted girls disproportionately. Shorts must be longer than your fingertips. Shoulders must be covered, no ripped jeans, no leggings, no open-toed shoes, etc. But me? I found a loophole. The handbook said all clothing must be neat, clean, and modest, Exceptions may be made for attire related to religious, cultural, or educational expression. I realized educational expression wasn't defined, so I began showing up wearing themed outfits for my imaginary independent study on American fashion history: 70s bell-bottoms, 80s neon aerobics leggings, 90s ripped grunge jeans, 60s tie-dye crop tops, Victorian-inspired lace blouses. Every day, I had a typed paragraph explaining how my outfit reflected a historical trend in American youth culture. They couldn't write me up. I was following the rules perfectly. Then other students joined. Then entire classes joined. One teacher even helped us print stylistic justification notes. Administration cracked after 2 weeks. The principal sent an email saying the dress code was being reviewed and would be simplified. The new dress code? Wear clothes. That was it. Revolution by loophole.